Some betrayals crash into your life like storms, loud and violent, leaving everything broken in their wake. But others arrive quietly disguised as routine slipping into familiar rooms and familiar faces until the moment they finally reveal themselves. I didn't know that the night I walked into Vanessa's perfect candle-lit dining room would become the line separating the life I had tolerated from the life I was finally brave enough to claim. I only knew the way her heel slammed into the back of my chair, sliding it out from under me, and the way she said with that brittle little smile, "Go to the kitchen, Elena. Adopted children don't eat with the real family." The laughter that followed was sharp and intentional, as if every fork and every polished glass on that table was complicit. I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. I simply turned, walked to my purse, and laid a thick envelope in the center of the table. "Mom and Dad left me this," I said quietly, watching their smiles evaporate in an instant. But that moment, the one that sent panic flickering across each of their faces, wasn't truly the beginning. It was only the first crack in a story that started decades earlier with the house I grew up in and the people who taught me early what it meant to be loved by some and tolerated by others. My name is Elena Hayes, and for most of my life, I clung to the belief that being adopted into the Hayes family didn't place me on the outside. Robert and Eleanor never let me feel different. They were steady, warm, the kind of parents who showed up to every recital and every parent-teacher meeting as if the world turned on the axis of my existence. My father had a habit of resting his hand on my shoulder whenever he sensed I was nervous, while my mother whispered the same line to me every birthday, "You're our daughter," in every way that matters. Their love was real heavy with intention, and the only reason I managed to survive the subtle cruelty of Vanessa, Jason, and Sabrina as we grew up under the same roof. With them, the reminders of my difference came in small, razor-like gestures. Vanessa would shift her body just enough in family photos to push me out of frame. Jason would tease, "Don't worry, Elena. No one will notice you're not one of us." Sabrina specialized in polite cruelty, the soft smile that disguised a sharper truth. It was a constant balancing act, my parents building me up as fast as my siblings tore pieces away. The years passed, and I built a life of my own. I married Michael, gentle and steady in all the ways I didn't know I needed. We had Emma and Noah, whose laughter filled rooms the way my childhood home never had. And for a long time, I thought the distance between me and my siblings was simply adulthood pulling us into separate lives. But then came the 6 months that shifted everything when both Robert and Eleanor fell sick, and I moved into their home without hesitation. I slept in rigid hospital chairs, signed forms, dealt with bills and treatment plans, combed my mother's hair when she could no longer lift her hands, and whispered reassurances to my father that I no longer believed myself. Michael took care of our children, telling me, "Do what you need to do. I've got us." Meanwhile, Jason said he couldn't risk exposure because of work. Sabrina insisted her twins needed her constant attention, and Vanessa claimed she couldn't handle watching them fade. So the days blended together, and the burden, the privilege of loving my parents at the end, fell entirely on me. When they passed only days apart, I felt hollowed out, as if grief had carved me open. And though my siblings swooped back in with the theatrics of devoted children at the funerals, I still wanted to believe the best in them. That was my first mistake. The second was agreeing to the dinner Vanessa offered to host, supposedly in honor of our parents. She even assigned tasks with her usual precision. "Elena, you handle the cooking. You're the best with Mom's recipes." I spent 3 days preparing dishes that smelled like childhood and hope. I chose a bottle of wine I could barely afford, wore a dress my mother once said, complimented my smile, and let myself believe, truly believe that grief might soften old wounds. But when I stepped inside Vanessa's pristine house that night, something in the air shifted. The dining table was set with my mother's china, which Vanessa had insisted on keeping for sentimental reasons, even though she barely visited during those final months. Soft music drifted through the room and candles cast a warm glow over everything, but beneath it all was a stillness, a tension, humming quietly like a conversation cut short just moments before I arrived. Vanessa greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're early," she said, smoothing her blouse. "Just put everything in the kitchen. We'll take care of the rest. We not you, not family. Them." As I unpacked the dishes in the kitchen, the ache of my childhood returned, standing outside closed doors, hearing laughter I wasn't meant to join, watching traditions continue without me. I told myself I was imagining things, that grief was twisting my perception. But when dinner began and they spoke over me as if I were hired staff, I felt the truth settle heavily in my chest. And when they finally said it aloud, Jason talking about their parents' house, Sabrina insisting assets should stay in the bloodline, Vanessa smirking softly as she said, I could keep sentimental things, something inside me went very still. And that was the moment I stood up, walked to my purse, and retrieved the envelope my mother had pressed into my hand days before she drifted into unconsciousness. I placed it at the center of the table and said, "Call your lawyers. We'll meet tomorrow." Their faces shattered beautifully, shock, fear, confusion, as I walked out of the house without looking back. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the sharpness of the previous night had settled into a heavy, buzzing quiet inside my chest. I barely slept, replaying each expression over and over, the disbelief in Jason's clenched jaw, the crack in Sabrina's practiced smile, the way Vanessa's composure finally fractured for the first time in her perfectly curated life. It was strange how silence could echo louder than shouting. Michael drove me downtown just after 9 a.m., gently squeezing my hand whenever my breath hitched. He didn't tell me I was doing the right thing. He didn't tell me to be strong. He simply said, "You don't owe them the version of yourself they expect." And somehow that truth steadied me more than any reassurance could. The Hayes estate attorney's office sat in a brick building with tall windows, sunlight catching on the polished brass handles of the door. The receptionist led us to a long conference room with dark wooden walls and chairs that looked as if no one ever truly relaxed in them. And there they were. Vanessa sitting stiffly with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had faded to white. Jason leaning back with an air of entitlement, cracking at the edges, and Sabrina staring at a stack of papers she hadn't bothered to read, her thumb running circles around her wedding ring. Jason's wife, Lauren, the corporate law shark, sat beside him in a charcoal suit, already scrolling through her tablet with a calculated air. On the opposite side of the table, Sabrina's husband, Ryan, tapped a pen nervously against a spreadsheet printout. No one looked at me when Michael and I entered. No one offered a greeting. The air felt thick enough to wade through. And then the door opened and Gregory Lang stepped in. Robert and Eleanor's attorney for over 2 decades, Gregory had a calm, steady presence that used to reassure me as a teenager whenever my parents brought me along for meetings. Now he greeted Michael warmly, nodded at me, and offered a polite but unreadable glance at my siblings. "Your parents spoke of you often," he said to me gently before taking his place at the head of the table. His words hit with unexpected weight, a reminder of the final months when they had confided everything to me because I was the one who stayed. Gregory opened a thick folder with practiced precision. The room fell utterly silent. "We are here to review the last will and testament of Robert and Eleanor Hayes," he said, and even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to pause. Vanessa straightened in her chair. Jason folded his hands like he did in business meetings, adopting a composure he didn't quite own. Sabrina stared at the table as if afraid to look up. Before we begin, Gregory continued, "I want to acknowledge the letter Elena presented last night." Vanessa stiffened visibly. Jason muttered something under his breath. Sabrina bit her lower lip. Your parents wrote several private letters before they passed, Gregory said. The one Elena shared is authentic and aligns directly with the revisions they made 8 months ago. Something rippled across the table, a twitch in Jason's jaw, a tremor in Sabrina's exhale, a tiny crack in Vanessa's mask. 8 months ago, the time when their health began to fail, the time when I moved into their home and my siblings found excuses not to. Vanessa forced her voice to stay smooth. There must be an error. Our parents would never exclude any of us. There is no error, Gregory replied. He lifted the will and began reading aloud, delivering each word with deliberate clarity. The entirety of the Hayes estate property, financial accounts, personal belongings, insured assets, and all investments is to be inherited by their daughter, Elena Hayes. I watched the moment it landed, the moment the truth cut through the room like a blade drawn quietly in the dark. Jason's head snapped up, fury flooding his features before he masked it with indignant disbelief. Sabrina's lips parted in a silent gasp, her eyes brimming with fear more than grief. Vanessa blinked rapidly as if willing herself to wake from a nightmare. Gregory kept reading the legal wording, but I barely heard it. All I felt was the weight of the moment, the shift in the room, the trembling silence, the realization that the truth my parents left behind carried more power than I ever expected. Jason broke first, leaning forward with a scowl that soured the air between us. "This is absurd," he snapped. "We're their biological children." He cut himself off at the last second, but the implication still hung there like smoke. Lauren stepped in immediately, her voice sharp. "We request to review their medical records. There may have been diminished capacity when these revisions were signed." Gregory didn't even flinch. Both Robert and Eleanor were evaluated by 2 separate physicians. They were fully competent. Vanessa's voice cracked as she insisted they loved all of us. They would never do this. Gregory nodded gently. "They did love all of you, but they told me something during the final revisions, and I have been instructed to share it." He looked at me for permission. I nodded, even though my throat felt tight. He lifted a handwritten note, its edges softened with time. They said, "Our children have grown into adults with their own lives, but Elena is the one who never left our side, not out of obligation, but love. She took care of us when no one else would. We want to give her the security she has always given us." Sabrina covered her face with her hands. Jason scoffed, muttering, "So she babysits for a few months and gets everything?" Heat rose in my chest. 6 months, I said quietly. 6 months of hospitals and bills and watching them disappear. Where were you? No one answered. Gregory continued. "There is also a clause regarding challenges to the will." Jason sat up straighter, eyes narrowing. "What clause?" "If any beneficiary attempts to contest it, they forfeit any claim to family heirlooms, photographs, or sentimental items. Everything will be donated." This time, the panic wasn't subtle. Vanessa's breath caught audibly. Sabrina's eyes widened in horror. Even Jason's confidence faltered. For the first time, they realized the magnitude of what they stood to lose, not just wealth, but the legacy they believed belonged to them by birthright. And then Sabrina spoke, her voice barely audible. "Elena, you wouldn't let that happen, right? We're still family." Her words were soft, but something inside me had hardened too much to bend. "Are we?" I asked. "Because my childhood memories of this family look nothing like yours." The room stayed painfully still, and as I stared at each of them, their fear, their entitlement, their sudden desperation, I felt a strange, steady calm spread through me. My parents had chosen me. They had trusted me. And I would not betray that trust, not for their comfort, not for their approval, and not for the fragile illusion of a family that never made room for me. For a long stretch, no one spoke. It was as if the room itself was struggling to breathe, weighed down by the truth my siblings had spent their entire lives believing could never touch them. Gregory closed the folder with a quiet finality, the soft thud echoing more sharply than any argument. The sound seemed to jolt Jason back into motion. He pushed his chair away from the table with a force that made the legs screech across the floor, muttering, "We'll find leverage. There's always leverage." But even as he said it, there was a tremor beneath the bravado, a recognition settling into his bones that this time the entitlement he'd always carried might not be enough to save him. Lauren immediately reached for her tablet, scrolling through legal references, whispering strategies to him as if she could rewrite the past simply by speaking quickly enough. But she didn't have the facts on her side, and she knew it. Sabrina stared at me with tears streaking the foundation on her cheeks. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "What do you want from us, Elena?" Her words carried something odd, half plea, half accusation, as if I somehow held the key to repairing the years of damage they had inflicted, as if I was responsible for saving the dynamic they had broken. I took a breath and let myself feel the weight of every memory, the whispered jokes about being different, the deliberate exclusions, the staged family traditions I watched from the sidelines, the years I convinced myself that kindness would be enough to change them. Then I felt something inside me shift, a clarity I had never allowed myself before. "I want peace," I said, steady and quiet, "but I won't negotiate my parents' wishes. They made their choice, and so did you." For a moment, I thought Vanessa might finally break. Her eyes glistened and she leaned forward as if reaching for something that wasn't there. But then her jaw tightened, the old instinct to control snapping back into place. "This isn't over," she murmured, more to herself than to me. Gregory looked at her with a calm she couldn't crack. "Actually," he said, "it is. What comes next depends entirely on how you respond to the will, not on Elena." And then, as if sensing the exact moment to deliver the final blow, he added, "Your parents left a private message for Elena." He handed me a small cream-colored envelope, the paper worn from handling, but still intact. My breath caught as I slid my finger beneath the flap. Inside was a single line in my mother's handwriting, one I had watched her form for years on birthday cards and notes tucked into my lunchbox. "You were always ours. Now let us take care of you the way you took care of us." The room blurred as the words settled into me with a warmth that dissolved something I hadn't even realized I'd been holding. For the first time since they passed, I felt their presence not as loss, but as love. When I looked up, every pair of eyes was on me. Some held resentment, some disbelief, and a small bitter few held a flicker of something dangerously close to regret. The things they had taken for granted their whole lives, their status, their bloodline, their perceived superiority were unraveling right in front of them. I stood slowly, my chair scraping softly against the floor. My hand hovered over the brass handle of the conference room door. And then I heard it, Vanessa's voice, soft and trembling. "Elena." Wait. There was a time when that tone would have pulled me back, would have ignited a fragile hope that this moment could mend what had been broken for decades. But not anymore. Without turning, I simply said, "You told me to go to the kitchen, and I'm done eating scraps." Then I stepped out into the hallway, leaving behind the people who had placed me behind them my entire life. Michael was waiting in the car parked along the quiet street in front of the building. When I opened the passenger door and slid inside, the tightness I had been holding in my chest finally cracked open. The moment his hand reached for mine, warm and familiar, the tears began slow at first, then spilling freely as if the years of swallowing hurt had suddenly become impossible to contain. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply pulled my hand to his lips, leaned his forehead against mine, and let me unravel. The days that followed were a blur of emotional whiplash. Jason called twice with veiled threats disguised as legal discussions. Sabrina showed up on my doorstep crying, insisting there had been misunderstandings. Vanessa sent flowers, orchids, her favorite, not mine, with a long card about family unity and miscommunication. Each attempt chipped at the edges of my resolve, testing the lines I had drawn. But for the first time in my life, I didn't bend. I didn't shrink to make myself easier for them. "I forgive you," I told each of them eventually. But forgiveness doesn't rebuild what you destroyed. And those words, spoken with calm finality, were the first bricks of the boundary I had needed my entire life. What surprised me wasn't their anger, it was their shock. My siblings had always relied on my silence, my desire to belong, my willingness to give more than I received. The version of me who walked out of Gregory Lang's office was a stranger to them, someone unrecognizable because she no longer needed their acceptance. And that truth, I realized, frightened them more than losing the inheritance ever could. Weeks passed in a strange rhythm, some days quiet, almost peaceful, and others heavy with the echo of phone calls and unexpected visits. There was a moment at the grocery store, sometime around 5 p.m., when I found myself reading a label without truly seeing the words. The loudspeaker crackled overhead, carts rattled across the tile, and yet everything felt muffled, as if I were trapped beneath a thick layer of memory. Grief does that. It traps you in small moments, unexpected places. I had barely turned the corner into the cereal aisle when I heard my name. Elena. The voice was gentle, cautious. I turned to see Monica Ruiz, the social worker who had guided my parents through so many impossible decisions during their final months. She had once sat at the Hayes dining table, listening to Eleanor describe her hopes for me, her fear that my siblings would one day push me aside, her certainty that I deserved a life filled with people who chose me. Monica's eyes softened when she took in my exhausted expression. We spoke briefly about my parents, about their kindness, their dignity, and the way they had faced the end with quiet acceptance. Then her voice wavered as she mentioned 2 little girl sisters, 4 and 3 years old, who had lost everything in an instant. No relatives able or willing to take both. No home that could keep them together. I don't know what changed in me at that moment, only that something opened a space I had once kept tightly guarded, a place carved by loneliness in childhood and filled by love in adulthood. The idea of 2 little girls being separated felt unbearable, and even before I said the words aloud, I felt the truth settle into me. I was ready to love again, to give the kind of family I had fought so hard to build for myself. The months that followed were slow and tender, full of paperwork, home evaluations, quiet conversations with Michael, and long nights where we imagined how our life would expand. Emma asked every evening if the girls would like the room she and Noah had decorated with stars and paper butterflies. Noah began setting aside his favorite stuffed animals just in case they get scared at night. In their small, gentle ways, our children understood what it meant to offer belonging before even knowing someone. 8 months after that day in the grocery store, Lily and Harper came home. I remember guiding them through the doorway, Lily clutching a worn backpack with trembling fingers, Harper holding tightly to Lily's sleeve, and realizing this was the moment everything in my past had been quietly preparing me for. That night, after baths that smelled like lavender and whispered assurances about the monsters that lived only in imagination, I tucked them into the beds Emma and Noah had made up with soft blankets and reassuring warmth. Emma sat nearby reading a story with slow, careful emphasis so the girls could follow along. Noah placed his favorite bear between them like a tiny guardian. I watched the scene unfold, feeling something simultaneously fragile and powerful bloom inside me, something I hadn't dared hope for when I was a child standing on the periphery of someone else's family. This time, I was the one building the circle, One year after Vanessa's dinner, the night that once felt like the worst moment of my life, I stood barefoot on the back porch of our new home, watching all 4 children race across the yard. Their laughter rose into the evening air, loud and unburdened, weaving through the tall grass like little ribbons of joy. Emma, taller and faster now, chased Noah with a plastic sword. Lily and Harper followed closely, clutching fistfuls of dandelions as if collecting treasure. Michael stepped behind me, wrapping his arm around my waist with the kind of touch that asks nothing except to be present. This, he whispered into my hair, is the real family. And I knew he was right. No courtroom, no bloodline, no last name could have defined family better than the sight of those 4 children running toward the setting sun with pure trust in their hearts. But life still had a way of bringing the past forward in unexpected moments. Sometimes a letter from one of my siblings would arrive polite, distant, written with the tone people use when they aren't sure how to apologize without fully admitting fault. Sometimes Sabrina would send photos of her twins with captions about milestones I no longer knew how to respond to. Jason tried once more to discuss financial arrangements, a thinly veiled attempt to renegotiate what the will had made unchangeable. Vanessa sent a message every holiday, carefully crafted, always long, always avoiding the truth. But I kept the boundary. Not out of spite, not out of vengeance, but because some wounds only heal when distance is allowed to settle over them like gentle snow. They had chosen who they were long before my parents left this world, and in choosing myself, I was finally letting go of the ache they had taught me to carry. What surprised me most in the year that followed wasn't how my siblings reacted. It was how quiet my heart became once I stopped trying to earn a place that was never intended for me. Peace doesn't always arrive with ceremony. Sometimes it arrives as the sound of children laughing in a backyard at 6 p.m., or the warmth of a hand twined with yours, or the stillness of a home where love has room to breathe. I realized then that my parents had given me more than an inheritance. They had given me freedom. The freedom to build the life I deserved, the freedom to love without fear, and the freedom to let go of the family that never learned how to hold me. And if you've ever been pushed aside by the people who were supposed to protect you, I want you to know this. You are not alone. Belonging is not something we receive from others. It's something we learn to choose for ourselves. And sometimes, the family we build becomes greater than the one we were born into. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, subscribe for more stories, and comment below. We read every message and your voice might be exactly the one someone else needs tonight.